Someone you love is gone. The body is there, but they are not. And you do not know what to do next. That feeling, that paralyzing hollow confusion, is not weakness. It is one of the oldest experiences in the human story. But what your ancestors actually did in that moment would shock you, because it was nothing like what you have been told. Death rituals are supposed to be about honoring the dead. That is what every culture tells you, but the real answer is far stranger. What ancient humans did when someone died was never really about the dead at all. It was always about the living. And the deeper you look, the more you realize that everything you do when you grieve today, every candle, every burial, every word spoken over a grave, is a piece of technology. Ancient emotional technology perfected over hundreds of thousands of years, designed to keep the survivors alive. Your brain has a problem. It cannot easily accept that someone is gone. Not emotionally, not neurologically. The person existed in your mental model of the world, in your expectations, your plans, your daily routines, and then suddenly they do not. Psychologist George Bonanno, one of the world's leading researchers on grief, has spent decades studying what actually happens inside the human mind when it loses someone. What he found is that the brain does not grieve in stages. It loops. It searches. It keeps reaching for the person who is no longer there, like a hand that keeps grabbing for something that has already been taken. That search is ancient, and your ancestors understood it without having a word for it. The oldest confirmed burial site on Earth is in a cave in South Africa called Pinnacle Point. Tools and pigment were found alongside human remains dated to roughly 100,000 years ago. But the discovery that stopped researchers cold was not the tools. It was the arrangement. The body had been placed deliberately, carefully, in a position that took effort. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had chosen not to leave the dead where they fell. Why? That is the question that changes everything. Archaeologist Paul Pettit, who has spent his career mapping the origins of mortuary behavior, argues that deliberate burial was not primarily spiritual in its earliest form. It was social. The act of placing the body, of touching it, moving it, arranging it, forced the surviving group to gather, to stop moving, to acknowledge, together, that something had changed. The burial was not for the dead person, it was for everyone still breathing. Think about that. The oldest known ritual in human history was a tool for emotional regulation, a forced pause in the chaos of survival that made the brain confront what it was already looping over. The body in front of you was not a ghost, not a presence, not an absence. It was evidence. And looking at evidence, even terrible evidence, is how the brain finally begins to update its model of the world. But burial was not the only thing ancient humans did. And what they did instead, in cultures across every continent, is far harder to process by modern standards. Many early human groups did not bury the dead at all. They consumed them. Mortuary cannibalism, the ritual eating of the deceased, has been documented in dozens of ancient cultures and continues in some form in isolated communities even today. The Fore people of Papua New Guinea practiced it into the 20th century. Neanderthal remains found across Europe show deliberate defleshing marks that bear no resemblance to butchery for food. The marks are careful, specific, ritualistic. Researchers from the Natural History Museum in London, led by Sylvia Bello, analyzed these marks in 2016 and concluded that Neanderthals were not eating the dead out of desperation. They were performing something that was meaningful to them in a way we can only partially reconstruct. What was meaningful? Connection. The logic, and it is a logic, not madness, is that the person does not leave. The person becomes part of you, literally. The boundary between the living and the dead is dissolved in the most physical way possible. You carry them forward. You do not abandon them in the ground. You take them with you. That is a grief technology. A different one. A stranger one. But a technology. In other ancient cultures, the dead were left elevated, placed in trees, on scaffolding, on rocky outcroppings, so that birds could consume the flesh. This was not neglect. It was deliberate elevation. The body was given to the sky, to something larger. In Zoroastrian tradition, towers of silence served this function for millennia. The logic again was not disposal. It was transformation. The dead were not gone. They were returning, cycling, becoming something else that moved freely in the world. Notice what every one of these practices shares. None of them let the survivors simply walk away. That is not an accident. Anthropologist Thomas Lynch, writing on prehistoric mortuary practices, observed that every known ancient burial tradition, regardless of what was done with the body, required extended community involvement. The group had to stay together, had to work together, had to speak together about the person who was gone. And in doing so, the surviving group was being rewoven. The social fabric that the death had torn was being repaired, thread by thread, through the ritual itself. Your ancestors understood something that modern grief culture often gets backwards. You do not grieve and then return to normal life. You grieve in order to continue normal life. The ritual is not a detour from survival, it is survival. Consider the grave goods. Across virtually every ancient burial site, from the Sungir burials in Russia, dated to 34,000 years ago, where a child was buried with thousands of hand-carved ivory beads, to the earliest Egyptian interments, objects were placed with the dead. Tools, food, flowers, pigment, jewelry. The famous Shanidar cave burial in Iraq, attributed to Neanderthals and dated to roughly 60,000 years ago, contained what appeared to be pollen clusters from medicinal plants placed in the grave. Though this interpretation has been debated, what is not debated is the deliberateness of the burial itself. Why bury things with someone who can no longer use them? Because the objects were never for the dead. They were for the living. Placing something beloved in the grave, something that connected the living to the dead, is an act of narrative closure. It says, this story had meaning. This person had meaning. The tool they carried matters enough to go with them. And in making that statement, you make it true. You transform the raw chaos of loss into a story with shape. And the human brain, above all else, needs stories with shape. This is what psychologists today call meaning-making. It is one of the most powerful predictors of healthy grief outcomes. People who find a way to build meaning around a loss, not to explain it away, but to give it a narrative place, recover. They carry the loss and continue. People who cannot build that meaning often do not. Your ancestors built it with their hands, with ochre and ivory and flowers, with fire and elevation and the careful placement of a body facing east. You do not need to know why east. The doing of it was enough. And what about the sounds? Because ancient death was never silent. Almost every culture documented by anthropologists, past and present, uses sound as a core element of mortuary ritual. Drumming, wailing, singing. The repetitive rhythmic sounds that seem almost universal in grief ceremonies are not decoration. Research by music psychologist Stefan Kilch has shown that repetitive rhythmic sound directly regulates the autonomic nervous system. It slows the heart. It entrains the breath. It moves the grieving body out of the acute stress response, the fight or flight state triggered by sudden loss, and into something the brain can sustain. The wailing is not despair. The wailing is medicine. Your ancestors discovered this empirically. Thousands of generations of trial and error. Groups that developed good grief rituals survived the death of their members and remained cohesive. Groups that did not, that scattered, that isolated, that had no mechanism for collective processing, fractured. The ritual was never superstition dressed up as tradition. It was a field-tested survival tool encoded into culture before there was a word for culture. Now think about today. Think about the modern moment after a loss. Someone calls the funeral home. Papers are signed. A date is set. People travel. They stand in a room together for an hour or two, then eat cold sandwiches, and then it is over. Many people feel, in the days after, a strange emptiness. Not grief exactly, but something unfinished. Something that did not close. And they feel guilty for feeling that, as if their grief is somehow insufficient, as if they are doing it wrong. They are not doing it wrong. The ritual has been compressed. The technology has been shortened. The extended community gathering, the days of presence, of shared work, of collective sound and story, has been flattened into an afternoon. And the nervous system, which runs on the same ancient hardware your ancestors had, does not know what to do with that. It keeps reaching. It keeps searching. It loops. When a loved one dies, you still reach for them in the morning. You still think of something funny you want to tell them. You still expect them at the table. That reaching is not failure. It is the oldest human reflex there is. It is the brain doing exactly what it was built to do. And what your ancestors built, the ritual, the gathering, the sound, the fire, the grave goods, the long, slow work of mourning, was a structure designed to meet that reflex, to honor it, to hold it long enough that the brain could finally, slowly, begin to update. Tonight, somewhere on Earth, someone will die, and the people who love them will not know what to do next. They will stand in that hollow, paralyzing space, and without thinking about it, they will do what humans have always done. They will gather. They will speak the person's name. They will sit together in the dark for a while. Not because anyone told them to, but because something older than language already knows what the living need. Someone you love is gone, and 100,000 years of human ritual have been quietly preparing you for exactly this moment.